Have you ever noticed how one wrong word can send an argument into a spiral, but yet the right words, spoken with sincerity, can bring everything back from the edge? Yes, I want to share with you why your relationship can get stuck in the same painful cycles, and most importantly, how to shift those patterns into connection. My hope is at the end of our time together, you're going to walk away with tools that you can begin to use right away. These small shifts that open the door to more trust, fewer repeat arguments, and these moments of closeness that you might have been missing due to what happens when conflict and resentment builds up. The way that you argue, whether you withdraw or over explain or lash out or shut down, these don't just appear out of nowhere, and they likely didn't start in the relationship you're in right now. Both of you carried imprints from your family of origin. Both of you likely carry some injuries and hurts from previous relationships. These create patterns that you've absorbed without even being aware that you were learning them. Maybe you watched your parents argue by slamming doors or not speaking to each other for days. Maybe you learned that staying silent was safer than speaking up, or raising your voice was really the only way to be taken seriously and heard. Then you add the weight of past relationships, things like heartbreak, all of that builds walls of defenses. And we live trying to avoid being disappointed again. Without realizing it, all of this is sort of operating behind the scenes, giving you a sense of how you're going to respond in the present moment. I remember working with a couple years ago. They loved each other deeply, but they both felt defeated inside of their relationship. It seemed that every fight circled back to the same painful loop. He believed he could never really please her, and she believed he didn't care. No matter how many times they argued, nothing changed. It circled around similar themes like that. What they couldn't see at first was that they weren't actually fighting each other. They were fighting ghosts from the past, old patterns they carried into their relationship. And once they began to see some of these hints, there could be some significant shifts. Instead, they began to bring tenderness into the conversation. And for the first time in years, because they could see some of these patterns with fresh eyes, they didn't get caught. They didn't get pulled under. And they could really hear what the other needed in those moments of tension. Love doesn't usually end in one big dramatic argument. Often, it erodes in the silences, in the arguments that never really get talked through and resolved, in the way you start to walk on eggshells instead of leaning in about what's really needed. Sometimes it's in the topics you both avoid because it feels easier than risking another argument. When stress like this builds up, it tends to leak into everything: our parenting, our work, our well being, and then somehow the person you love becomes the one that you hurt the most. I remember working with this couple, and she was convinced that her husband just never listened. And so she tried to raise her voice to really be heard, to be taken seriously. And every time she did this, he'd shut down. What she didn't realize was that his silence wasn't really about her. It was that he survived growing up with a father whose temper exploded without warning. When she could really understand the family imprint behind his reaction, that shutdown, he would just go right into protection mode, the fight could shift. Instead of her thoughts of, why don't you care? It began to be something along the lines of, how do we make each other feel safe? Safe enough to talk through what's difficult so that no one has to raise their voice and no one has to shut down. This opened up a shift where she could learn how to express herself in moments of frustration so that change was possible. And the real issues inside of their relationship could be talked about, could be sorted through. So, what looks like a marriage problem, a relationship issue, is often something deeper. It's a family pattern that's being replayed. So, the way we argue, the way our defenses kind of slip back in, they don't come out of nowhere. These are echoes of what we saw, felt, even absorbed long before you ever found yourself in partnership with this person. And unless we bring them into the light, those patterns just don't stop. We actually have the risk of our children inheriting them too. I mean, we don't even want to be stuck inside of these patterns. We certainly don't want to share them or pass them on to our kids. The good news is, once you see the pattern, you can shift it. Once you understand what it's connected to, it doesn't have the same hold. So our first step is to connect why these arguments keep happening, why those circular conversations seem to pull you under. Here's something that you can try the very next time a small disagreement comes up before it spirals into something much bigger. What if you decided, instead of letting an argument stretch on for hours until you're both exhausted, saying things you're likely going to regret later, what if you set a timer for 30 minutes, knowing there's a clear boundary to make it safe to express what you're challenged about, what the trigger is, and it helps you stay focused on what really matters. The ability to speak openly and honestly about, here's what I made it mean when you said this. Or when our teenager came home super frustrated from their day and you answered this way and I wanted to answer that way. We're really focused on talking about the issue at hand. I think what happens is the frustration comes up, we make meaning out of it, we close it off, we put up our defenses, and then it comes out weeks, sometimes months later, in a much bigger form than it needed to be. By having that timer, you might not get to a solution that's agreed upon in just 30 minutes, but it'll bring you a lot closer to ideas that you can try and emotions that you didn't know were running behind the scenes. It'll bring you much closer to staying focused on what really matters so that you can move forward together. This is one of the ways we can calm triggers before they sort of take over. I mean, stress is contagious, but so is calm. So when you're feeling that frustration rising, make sure you check in with yourself, maybe taking 3 deep breaths and connecting with what's really going on here. Is this the stress of the moment or the built up stress of the day? Or is this something that's really going on inside of your partnership? It can be so important to differentiate. Is this about my partner or is this about my stress? 9 times out of 10, it's the stress talking. And checking in before reacting gives yourself a chance to get in front of it before reactivity takes over. This can save so many frustrating situations from turning into a full-blown argument. We want to be able to be our partner's safe place to land, and we want them to be that safe harbor for us. And so if we can figure out ways to manage the stress together, it can be a simple shift that changes everything. Turning stress into something that feels like a teamwork option instead of tension that's played out on each other. I remember working with a couple years ago, and they had this kind of code phrase. It was something like, I'm in the red zone. And of course, that meant I'm maxed out. I can't take on one more thing. And it was this place inside of their relationship, no judgment, no pushback, just support that's offered. Maybe you could come up with a phrase like that to interrupt misunderstandings in moments of tension that allow you to take a step back that much of the time is well needed. The strongest couples aren't the ones who never fight. They're the ones who learn how to repair and Do it quickly, reminding each other, hey, we're on the same team. What would change if some of the ways you express your frustration would stop feeling like a storm that comes in and instead was more like opening a door towards understanding and deepened closeness? What would it change if stress didn't pull you apart, but instead drew you together? I think it starts with mastering the patterns that used to run the show. First of all, we want the awareness to know it's the patterns that have taken over, so we can blame the pattern and not the person.